As Congress and the president debate a way to protect several 100,000 young immigrants from deportation, a federal judge rules against the president and for the Dreamers. Our panel of attorneys here to discuss that and other big legal issues of the day. Then there is growing consensus that President Trump will get interviewed as part of a Russia probe, or at least asked. We're going to take a look at how that would all work and the pitfalls it could have for the president. Also, speaking of President Trump, he says our libel laws are a sham and they ought to be changed. Why he ought to be careful what he wishes for. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. We begin tonight with deferred action for childhood arrivals, better known as DACA. Now, that is the Obama-era program that gives temporary legal status to at least 700,000 young immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. Now, it was put into place in 2012, but President Trump, he'd announced it would end March 5th unless Congress came up with a fix. That means, as I said, several 100,000 people now worried about getting deported, possibly to a country they've never remembered, let alone a language they may not even speak. So how to handle the Dreamers, that was the subject of a bipartisan meeting at the White House just yesterday. If you didn't see it, it was fascinating theater as the cameras caught the whole conversation.
It should be a bill of love, and we can do that. But it also has to be a bill where we're able to secure our border.
What about a clean DACA bill now, and with a commitment that we go into a comprehensive immigration reform procedure?
I have no problem. I think that's basically what Dick is saying. We're going to come out with DACA. We're going to do DACA, and then we can start immediately on the phase 2, which would be comprehensive.
Would you be agreeable to that?
Yeah, I would like to do that.
Mr. President, you need to be clear, though. I think what Senator Feinstein's asking here, when we talk about just DACA, we don't want to be back here 2 years later. You have to have security, as the Secretary would tell you.
Translation, whoa, Mr. President, do you understand what you just agreed to here? So there was a lot of that in a conversation, frankly, about an hour of pretty riveting TV. Now, if you thought that was the end of it, then Congress would try and hammer something out with whatever horse trading that would go into this before that deadline in March, well, hold on, because we have another new wrinkle and a major one at that in this issue. Federal court in San Francisco, they've just issued an injunction ordering the Trump administration to keep the DACA program in place and even start accepting new applications. The judge says there was no legal footing to ever discontinue it. Now, the president, he took to where else but Twitter to blast the decision, as well as more broadly our entire judicial system. Quote, "It just shows everyone how broken and unfair our court system is when the opposing side in a case such as DACA always runs to the Ninth Circuit and almost always wins before being reversed by higher courts." So a lot to unpack here, and let's bring in our legal panel to help us do just that. Mimi Rocha is a former federal prosecutor, now a professor at Pace Law School. Doug Von Oist, founding partner of Carson Von Oist. He focuses on corporate misconduct, and he was also selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial attorneys in the country. Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLC and a former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. And Daniel Goldman. He's a former federal prosecutor as well in the Southern District of New York. Guys, ladies, thank you very much for joining us. All right, like I said, a lot to get to here, but first off, was it completely unexpected that the Ninth Circuit was going to weigh in on this? Because it seemed that this was going to be a political decision with all the consequences attached, with a deadline, and then all of a sudden the court comes in and says not so fast.
Well, so, I mean, the Ninth Circuit, to be clear, hasn't quite weighed in on it yet, although I think that opportunity is going to come. The district court judge did rule in favor of the plaintiffs on the preliminary injunction. And, you know, it's a big deal, but it's also, as I think the Democrats who are in favor of legislation are now coming out and saying it's only a temporary fix. Because they gave temporary relief. They said that new applicants actually couldn't apply, as I understand it. So people who are here and already have status can continue to apply for extensions. But
didn't they also give discretion to DHS, that basically the Department of Homeland Security can, in effect, use some of their own discretion and judgment here?
Yeah, and that was and that's the basis of the judge's decision, actually, I think is important. The judge talks about in the decision that, this tradition of giving, he doesn't call it a tradition, but this pattern, this practice, this established practice of giving HSI, Homeland Security, discretion in how to enforce immigration laws, that's been going on for a really long time. And so for someone in the Trump administration, in this case Sessions, to come out and say that, you know, the law was established illegally by Obama, he said that's just not right. You know, actually, this is being arbitrary and capricious to say that that was established incorrectly.
Do a little schoolhouse rock for me, Dan, here in terms of how this works, because if you listen to the president today and some of his supporters, one court out in San Francisco with their own agenda, acting arbitrarily and capricious, he would argue, comes down and says, nope, can't do that. I'm going to put an stop on this thing. How does it work? Who has standing when it comes to these court rulings? Who gets to decide?
Well, any plaintiff can file a lawsuit. You have to have standing, and that was one of the issues that the district judge ruled on. Interestingly, one of the plaintiffs is Janet Napolitano, who is the head of the University of California University System, and she was the Secretary of Homeland Security in 2012, and she was the one who implemented DACA. So she certainly has firsthand knowledge of it, and she would be a pretty relevant person to have standing in her position at the University of California, where there are any number of immigrant or students.
But when people hear the phrase court shopping, okay, is that potentially what happens here? Could you have a more conservative district court where somebody else is going to file a claim and that would trump this? Where does this end? Obviously, we've got to have a settlement. Mimi said it right. This is temporary. This isn't permanent. But can people just keep going to different district courts here to get different rulings and keep changing policy in effect?
Absolutely, and that happens all the time. And ultimately, that is something that the Supreme Court focuses very much on when they're deciding which cases to take. Whether the Ninth Circuit has ruled one way and another circuit, and in this particular case on this topic, the Fifth Circuit has a prior ruling that the judge had to distinguish from. And so what would happen or could happen in theory if this were to play out and there weren't a congressional resolution to it is that the Ninth Circuit would rule. It may be in tension with the Fifth Circuit, and then the government would take it up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, if they felt like it was significant enough to rule on because of what's usually called a circuit split, then the Supreme Court would ultimately decide. You
know, Doug, in the ruling, the court said that the president's action here was, in their terms, arbitrary and capricious. In that, I'm curious, you think they got it right in that you can argue that he was seeking a remedy in search of a problem, in that I haven't heard anyone overwhelmingly, I know this is now into politics or even into policy, not necessarily law, that 90% of the public, roughly, 80 some odd percent supports the Dreamers, et cetera. In picking a date here that they were going to do it, was the president being arbitrary or capricious, or could it be argued he telegraphed this for months, he gave the legislative branch the opportunity to remedy this. If they don't get it done by March, it's not like they weren't told that this could happen. Do you think the court overstepped their bounds here, or did they get it right?
Well, I think if you look at it as a process, I think the court got it right. There was something in place that was looked at before. It was in place. People were given certain rights and expectations under what was in place, and it was suddenly taken away. And now there'll be an appellate process to review that decision. And so if you look at it as part of a process, the court definitely got it right.
You know, Mayor, also interestingly, once again, the court said the president's own comments impacted their decision. This is not without precedent in the last 11 months here. He said the same thing happened when it came to the Muslim ban. I know he's not going to listen, but his words and his tweets have come back to bite him on numerous occasions with the law right now, because you can divine, I suppose, if I read the ruling right, tell me if I'm doing wrong, the judges are ruling what the intent or what the state of mind for the president, why he's doing this and how far reaching. It's not just that he's doing it and then you say, well, he's saying that it was executive order over stuff. He's specifically putting his own animus, if you will, into why he's doing these things, and the court then comes to the conclusion of, arbitrary and capricious. he's sometimes his own worst enemy here, right?
Absolutely, and courts have been doing that more than I think they should for the last several years. And one of the other cases was Bill Cosby, where, but for the manner in which he presented himself in the public, the statute of limitations certainly would have precluded any kind of charges against him, and they actually extended it and said that he basically more or less opened the door and added to that time. I disagreed with that. But here, when you're looking to see if there's discriminatory intent, and you have a president like President Trump, who speaks probably more than any president that I can recall, and also in an unscripted manner without consulting with his advisors, yes, when he says, you know, we're going to build a wall, we're going to get them all out, they're all rapists and murderers, well, that's stuff that you can contemplate when you look to see, is it really a pure intent or is there a discriminatory intent?
So how do you think this ends? I'm not asking for the political solution because in many ways, I think this complicates it, because if you ever want to get legislation done, you always need a deadline to help, especially in as partisan a culture. Now, people are like, wait a minute, the court jumped in, I don't have to stick my neck out and risk some political capital, Republican and Democrat. But how much time do they have?
Yeah, I mean, this can delay it, right? That people can use this as a way to say, all right, the court dealt with it. But, you know, these appeals of preliminary injunctions go quickly. They're not like other kinds of cases that sort of make their way through slowly.
We're talking months. We're not talking more than a year or something.
Oh, no, definitely not. Within a month time. But I just want to make one other, hopefully related point about what Trump tweeted about the courts. You know, as Dan was saying, you know, he says the court system is broken, and this is an example of that. And, you know, it's so easy to get caught up in each little tweet that he says, but it's part of this pattern that he does, where if someone rules on something or says something or takes an action that he disagrees with or doesn't like, he then, instead of critiquing it or disagreeing with that individual decision, he attacks the whole system.
Well, we'll get into later in the show about libel, what he said, and the more broad application. But, Dan, in a punctuation of this thing, in the end, do you think this gets decided in a courtroom, or do you think this gets decided, you know, by a vote of 435 guys and women in the House?
I think it gets decided by statute. I don't think ultimately there's going to be a legal decision that is going to rule the day on this. I think generally it sounds like Republicans and Democrats are more or less in consensus about extending this in some fashion. I think what's going on right now is there's the horse trading about how much leverage the Republicans can use.
What is a wall? That's really what this comes down to. What can you claim victory for that they're willing to stomach, and who are you going to be willing to annoy when it comes to your respective bases? But you know, it'll be fascinating how that turns out. But I think the monkey wrench that got thrown into this by the court, I'm not saying wrongly, but I think that it's led to some confusion that takes the accelerator off the pedal in Washington to deal with this, but we shall see. All right, staying in Washington, the president was asked today whether or not he will talk with Mueller's team for the Russia probe if asked. He said he consulted with his own attorneys before calling the whole thing a witch hunt. Give you a hint, he still says no collusion. But how would an interview with the President of the United States work here? We've got some precedent to help answer that question, but also, what could the risks attached be as well? Stay with us.